Good morning to all. It is with immense delight that I welcome you to the third day of the national webinar, PRAJWALA, webinar on research methodology, research ethics, literary theory and praxis, organized by the Postgraduate Department of English and Research Center for Comparative Studies, Mercy College, Palakkad. It is my pleasure to welcome the resource person for the final keynote session of the webinar, Dr. Gopika Shankar, who happens to be an alumna of the Department of English, Mercy College. After completing her post-graduation from Mercy, Dr. Gopika took her PhD from IIT Madras. She had worked as ad hoc lecturer at NIT Calicut and NIT Trichy before she joined University of Hyderabad. Dr. Gopika has numerous publications in journals and conference proceedings and has also contributed chapters to books on Indian English fiction. She has been course reviewer for NPTEL web courses offered by IIT Madras in 2012. You have done your alma mater proud, Dr. Gopika, and on behalf of the department and myself, I extend a warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah. Let me also welcome our dear principal, Dr. Sister Gisela George, to the webinar. Thank you, sister, for gracing the occasion with your presence. Let me also welcome all the participants to the final keynote session of this webinar. Before I conclude, I'd like to place on record my sincere gratitude to all the participants who joined us on all the 3 days of the webinar. My sincere thanks also go to the paper presenters, research scholars and students for their active involvement. Thank you so much for your overwhelming support. My sincere thanks also go to the webinar coordinators, Dr. Trusina M. Malapat, Dr. Prasida G. and Ms. Priyanka MC, moderators for the paper presentation sessions, Dr. Sridevi K. Menon, Dr. Nila N., Ms. Sonia Thomas, Ms. Raki NP, Mr. Jace John, and Ms. Bhavna, our alumna, for lending technical support. Thank you for taking the pains to ensure the smooth conduct of the 3-day national webinar. So, welcoming one and all to the final keynote session, I conclude my words. Thank you. Now, let me call upon Dr. Gopika Shankar to deliver her keynote address on the topic, Spatial Literary Studies. Gopika, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. First, before I begin, let me thank Ma'am Sheena and all the faculty members of Mercy College and the coordinators, then Principal Sister Gisala and everyone. So thank you so much, and all of you who are here. So now I guess I can start. So this is on spatial literary studies, as I have already given the topic. And I'll be talking about spatial literary studies and this new branch, which is fast becoming becoming one of the major schools of literary theory or criticism today, which is geocriticism. So spatial literary studies has been in existence for a long time, but geocriticism is basically like a school of criticism, which is associated with a group of people. So we look into these things. So I'll just start presenting now. I hope you can see this. 1 second. Okay, can you see the screen now? Can you all see the screen? Could somebody please tell me?
Yes, Miss, we can see your criticism.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so This is spatial literary studies and geocriticism, as I have mentioned. So we can just see from the beginning, right? So when we think about space, right? So what is the idea of space or place, or even like different concepts related to space? So essentially, we are talking about social spaces here. And if you look at other disciplines, geography or sociology, or some of these other disciplines which deal with the concept of space, place, region, and those kind of spatial constructs, we can see that they do a lot of studies in that, right? So apart from that, even engineering disciplines and many other disciplines. But literature too has been dealing with space in its own way. And in any literary text, if you see from the idea of setting, if it is whether it is just providing a background to being a character in a fiction, for instance, place or space has its own purpose, right? So it's something, for instance, a city can be a character in a novel, right? So like that. So spatial literary studies. So not just about spatial literary studies, space has a significant role in literature. So apart from that, so now when you talk about space in literature, so you might be having this doubt: is it about the literature as a space, right? So literary space as such, or is it about the space in literature? So we are looking at the representation of space in literature, or how space gets represented in literature. But if you see, even literature itself can be seen as a kind of a space, right? So literary space. So this is something that spatial theorists like Henry Lefebvre and Edward Soja have been talking about. So we'll get to that shortly. So before that, so that is something to do with, just a brief introduction on how literature has been dealing with space and spatial literary studies too. So apart from how when we talk about how something, like city or a village gets represented in fiction, if you look at how these things are also, these ideas or these constructs are also studied, right? So spatial literary studies has been in existence for a long time, but in a slightly different way, right? So if you look at, if you're just, looking at the global scenario as such, and not just English literature or not just European studies as such, you can see even in the Indian context, right? This Sthala Purana, or even if you look at, the concept of Tinnai in Sangam literature. So these are some of the early studies that we had from the Indian context, right? So the concept of how places, right? So the concept of place in particular got studied in those days, right? So apart from that, if you see even like landscape studies, or village prose, this was a Russian movement, then regionalism and local coloring studies, eco-criticism. So these are all, to name a few, some of the movements which came in existence. Then there is, of course, geopoetics. So like that, there are several imageology. So some of these, related movements before this branch called geocriticism started gaining significance. Okay. So now these are some examples that I think of at this moment. English European literary studies, that is Country and the City by Raymond Williams. Then Seeking a Venice in American Nature Writing, Henry Thoreau, Annie Dillard, Edward Abbey. So this is actually, one of the key texts in eco-criticism. Then The City in Literature, then Imagine Cities, The City in Literature by Richard Lehan. So Richard Lehan's City in Literature is actually something, so this was inspired by this text called The City in History by Louis Mumford's City in History. Okay, so that is one major text that was inspired by that work. Then you have Imagine Cities, Robert Alters, then Writing Out of Place, Regionalism, Women, and American Literary Culture. So these are some of the other texts that you can see related to, where you can see how different kinds of spaces or places are actually discussed, and how they are discussed in literature. So that gets actually critiqued. Now, before we get into this idea of like how spatial literary studies became a full-fledged branch, we'll see how, the spatiality turn and mobility turn in humanities and social sciences as such contributed to this growing discipline, right? So this is now spatiality turn. So this was sometime, so you have different kinds of turns in humanities and social sciences as such. So that would be like the cultural turn, you have the affective turn, then you have the spatiality turn, mobility turn. So mobility turn is a very recent movement, right? So it's something very recent. And when you actually look at the COVID times today, It's one of the most important, area that you can actually study, this whole idea of mobility. So that is also closely connected. Even in literature, you can see how mobility is also represented. So by spatiality term, what we mean is, so this was essentially a major chunk of this work was begun by our spatial theorist, that is Henry Lefebvre, with his the production of spaces. Okay, so this is a very monumental, voluminous work on the idea of space, and it's a very huge. It may be a bit confusing to even other sociologists have been bewildered by this work, right? So this is the production of space. So in that, Lefebvre is actually telling you like how, space, the concept of space was monopolized by mathematics and philosophy, particularly mathematics, right? So when you talk about space, now, of course, this may not look all that unique, or it may not look shocking to you anymore, because we talk about my space, your space, this space, that space, all kinds of spaces, right? But at that point, when Lefebvre and when these theorists started their work, the concept of space was mostly related to mathematics, mathematical sciences, geometry, and so like that, space time in physics. So those were, some of the disciplines. Then, of course, philosophy. So what Lefebvre wanted to see was, because if you're looking at mathematics or philosophy, these are talking about the more of the conceptualized spaces, or the what he finds as, these are conceptions, right? So more than the real space as we live, or, as a kind of social space, right? So they don't give so much of importance. So philosophy, of course, does talk about social spaces today, but in those days, right? So mostly it was something to do with the other ideas, right? So from that, he's talking about the real social spaces. So he said, so in this book, he's trying to actually bring in a kind of a unitary model for studying spaces. So with that, he gives in this whole idea of spatial triad, and which is later explored by Soja as a trialectics of space. So we'll look at Soja a little later. So before that, going into Lefebvre's concept. So this is spatial practice, representation of space, and representational space. So the same thing has been, so this is actually Lefebvre's three concepts, the triad: spatial practice, representation of space, and representational space. And this has been later, again, if you look at, the current theorists, they talk about this idea in terms of perceived space, conceived space, and lived space. So, so spatial practice, as in, it's like what he means is, how the society space is created. Okay, so we essentially, Lefebvre's idea is that we are all spatial beings, right? So we all require our space in some way or the other, whether it is our physical space or mental space, or whatever, whether it's real or imagined and all these, right? So there are several terms, but whatever kind of space, human beings are essentially spatial beings, right? So just as we are territorial beings. So it's something that we'll see again. So, so in this, you can just think of it like this: the real space, the imagined space, and then the lived space. So perceived space, as in, so who are the people who actually work with the perceived space? So the real physical spaces. So that would be like, the geographers, the civil engineers, and people who actually go and then, who actually explore these physical spaces, with which, for instance, if you're looking at the whole concept of a city, or the whole concept of a place, or where a place is actually formed, so that is the real physical space. So that is a perceived space. And then, for instance, if you're looking at the plan, right? So if you're looking at a house, and then you have the plan of that house, right? So that plan would be what you call the conceived or the conceptualized space. So similarly, like how you have maps, you have diagrams, so all those kind of things, these are all conceptualized spaces. So even some of these mathematical spaces and philosophical spaces, in Lefebvrean terms, they come under the idea of representation of space, or what you call the conceptualized or conceived space. And then the lived space, right? So once you have this perceived space, that is a space which is already in existence, and then when you start living, right? So that is when actually the more the more detailed and the more complicated things start coming in. So how, for instance, see, a space may have a particular definition. For if you're looking at a very simplistic idea, so I'll try to put it as simplistically as possible. If you're just looking at, for instance, say, your living room in your home, right? So that has a particular purpose, but you may use it for something else, right? Or your kitchen is meant for cooking, but then people can even sleep there. For you have one room apartments, right? So you have studio apartments where people do like or many people live in one particular like a small room. So like that, how when you start living, what are the some of the things that come in with that, right? So that is a concept of lived space to make it as simple as possible. Or if you're looking at the concept of a classroom, for instance, right? So in a classroom, you go there, you sit and study, right? So the teaching and learning is what is supposed to happen, but then people can sit and sleep there, or people maybe students may fall asleep, students may be dreaming there, you may be even chatting with your friends if you're allowed to use mobile phones. So like that, you can do so many things, right? So when you actually start, so the concept is this, and it has a certain plan, and then this is the actual physical space, but then when you start using, right, so when you live, this is what it becomes. Okay, so now here I'm talking about all these concepts, and then we'll see how we look at a few examples from literature, okay, from literary studies. So this is the idea. This idea was later developed by Edward Soja as first space, second space, and third space. This is a bit more, this is in fact more advanced and, or rather more transparent than Lefebvre's definitions. But it's almost the same, first and second space. So another thing is what Lefebvre is saying is, see, if you actually look at this whole idea of space, it's already in existence, right? So the nature, whatever, the nature created spaces. Nature has already created these spaces, and from there we are creating these, we are producing these. That is why he's talking about this whole concept of production of space, as in the production of social spaces. So here production is, of course, you have to understand it, it has the Marxist connotations there. So just as we produce things, can you produce space also like that? Is space an entity which can be produced in a similar way? Okay, so these are some of the other questions that Lefebvre raises, but I'm not going too much into those details here. But how do we produce spaces? So do we, so what do you think? So let me ask you a question here. So do you think that we are engaged in the production of spaces? Do you think we, as in, are human beings involved in the production of spaces? Yes or no? Anybody? Can anyone just tell me? Nobody? My God. Okay. No issues, I guess. Anyone? Are you able to actually understand, are you able to follow? Yes. Okay. Someone says, Shijila. Thank you so much. Yes. So, I mean, is it that you can't speak? Are you all muted from the, I don't know, maybe if that is the case, then it's okay. We'll just discuss this during the discussion part. All right. So yes, so when we talk about this, right? So how, from the nature, so nature's spaces are, in Lefebvre terms, it's a kind of a work. On the other hand, when you're looking at the human created spaces, it becomes, or the produced spaces, it becomes a kind of a product, right? So just as we have in the production of things, you have, all those kinds of, the politics of production comes into this too. So if you actually think about it, right? So if you're looking at it, whether it is, the space which existed in the feudalistic times, or, whether it's in the capitalistic production of spaces, you will see, right? So if you're looking at the concept of, how real estate developers actually work on that, the concept of gentrification, or when it comes to urbanization, how all these things, yes, okay, there's another person saying human beings create spaces. Yeah, thank you. That's good, right? So we do, right? So these are like, if you see, those are like the bigger things, right? So when you're talking about something like, real estate developers or the policy makers, all those people who are involved in the production of spaces, that is a large scale development, like how, a city's develop, right? So that is a perceived space, and then the conceived space working there. Then, when we start living, right? So when others, who are not actually involved in the larger production of spaces, but who are also contributing in their own way, right? So in some way or the other, how things actually take a turn, right? So that is something. So the same ideas later developed by Soja, and then we look at in particular this concept of third space, which is why I shared that short story with you, that is the Alif. So Alif is Louis Bohé's short story, and then in that, in Bohé's Alif, so Soja actually went in third space. he's actually looking at this through several other movements. So one, he looks at this through Lefebvre's analysis. Then he brings in Aleph, this short story analysis. He does that, and then he goes on to he looks at post-colonialism, and how it actually contributed to this spatial studies. Then he talks about feminism. So several movements which actually, so all these are interrelated, right? So you can't just throw away one movement. So it's not really possible. So that is something that Soja is actually talking about when he talks about in the this third space. So if you've read this story, that is the Aleph, you will find that this Aleph is actually in that, there's this narrator, that is Bohe, and then, there's this person, Daneri. So Daneri is supposed to be, there are like interpretations that he refers to, this is an allusion to Dante, right? So Dante, who wrote Divine Comedy. So in that, you will see that Bohe as the, he's sort of skeptical about Daneri's contributions and all that. So what is it that, but then he realizes, that it is Daneri who shows him this Aleph, right? So this particular point from which you can actually see all other points. So if you actually look at this, this example is, you may see, right? So in the Indian context also, you may come across this idea, like a particular point from where, you can actually visualize all other points. Like if you look at in mythology, like if you look at this concept of when Krishna opens his mouth, and then, Yashoda is actually able to see this entire universe. So the Aleph is that kind of a point, a particular spot from where, you can see this entire universe. So what does that actually mean? So here, so it's kind of, so if you actually see there is there are other things in that story, which I'm not going into those details now, but we'll connect this with this idea of third space. So third space is such a space where, you have all other perspectives, right? So it's not just like it's not just we can't say that it is simply the lived space, but a space where, all other perspectives come into play, right? So it is not just limited to the first space. First space is what we call the real physical space, and then the other one is the imagined space. That is the conceptualized spaces, the perceived, the conceived space, and then you have the third space, right? So the third one, right? So which has all these connotations. So this is because, they wanted to actually make these things more transparent, because otherwise, if you look at some of these disciplines, now all these things have changed a lot. But if you're looking at, but these are some of the texts which actually led to those changes, right? So which led to these new perspectives, and then, the innovative thoughts, and then how it actually reorganized some of these disciplines. So if you look at, for instance, if you're looking at geographical studies, right? So it may be limited to, see, if you look at the idea of a map, for instance. So there's another text called, that is another story called Do You Love Me by Peter Carey, something that you can note down. So in that, you will see how, this whole concept of maps have been actually questioned. So when we, as children, when we were in school, when we were given a particular map, and then, you would have been asked to draw this map, then reproduce it. So you would have just internalized it, memorized it, and then reproduced it on paper, whatever, right? So, so we assume that this is the reality, right? So it has a kind of a thing. For instance, the shape of a place, right? So it is by looking at the map, we decide, okay, this is how it is. But sometimes we get to know that the maps are not always, it's again relative. It's not always in black and white. So that is not the ultimate truth. So there is something, places can be hidden. So how, cartographers have a certain kind of a role in developing, in defining the society. So there's another, another important significant work which came in recent years in this idea is the Sellout. That is Paul Beatty's Sellout, which won the Booker too. That is the first American novel to win the Booker, in fact. So in that, you again see how, a place disappears. That is this city called Dickens, a fictional city. It disappears. And then this whole, so disappears as in how can a place disappear, right? So can spaces actually disappear? So maybe, so one idea that Lefebvre says is a space is never destroyed. That is, it may be transformed in some way or the other, but it can't be destroyed. But places can, right? So that we look at this concept of place a little later, but that is the idea that comes in Sellout, right? So before that, we'll just complete this idea of third space. So third space is such a space. So like the aleph, the third space is, something that which will actually give you the first and second space perspectives, and from where you can look at the universe in all directions. And similarly, you can say, literary space. Literary space, as in that is a literature as such, is a space which is it's a kind of a third space, right? So if you actually think about it, it's not, we can't just say it as second space, but it's a third space, right? So that is how I see it, because you can see several, you can look at different, you can look at the universe from all directions, in fact. So then what do we mean by thirding as othering, right? So this is one important concept that Soja is discussing. So before that, if you look at third space, this concept is something that Edward Soja is talking about. So even Homi Bhabha, whom you may be familiar with, Homi Bhabha, the post-colonial theorist, he also talks about this concept of third space. So for him, third space is, in fact, it's something when he talks about hybridity, right? So when you're looking at this concept of hybridity, and then you have mimicry, right? So mimicry is something, so what he says is like, whether, it is the migrants, or whether, people who belong to the earlier, when you look at the whole concept of colonization, right? So sometimes, people just imitate an accent, or, they may wear a certain kind of costume, and then, they may be just mimicking there, right? But hybridity is not the same as mimicry. So when you actually, hybridity is a different, thing altogether. So you have two contributing factors there, and then the third which emerges from that would have its own. So the whatever, from where a third emerges. So if you're looking at, for instance, if you're looking at the migrant condition, which would be easiest to understand, I guess. So if you're looking at immigration, for instance, migration, for instance, when you actually move to a different place, right? So from when you relocate to a different place, you learn certain things from that place. So you go with your whatever you you take something from your homeland, and then you go into that adopted land, and then that host city. So from there, whatever you're getting, so like that, how you have these intermingling cultures, right? So whether it is a racial hybridity or cultural hybridity, or whatever, the kind of hybridity that comes in, right? So then there is a third that is emerging. So that is where you have all these questions, like, for instance, is it a hyphenated identity, or is it a new identity? So if you're looking at, for instance, Asian American, you probably say, no, is it the Asian or the American, or is it the Asian American as a combination of both, right? So in that, this third one that has its own identity, it has the characteristics, or it has the features of those contributing factors, whatever they may be, but the third has its own its own identity. So like how, for instance, hybrid breeds are formed, right? In the animal world or in the plant world, you have hybrid plants, right? So they may not be exactly so they will have the parental, whatever qualities there, but they're not exactly the same as the parent. So which you will definitely know if you are into gardening, you will understand if you look at hybrid varieties, right? So similarly, just like that, human beings too, or any kind of condition, cultural conditions, or like that, the hybrid is that way, right? So that is the third space. So hybrid space is in fact a third space. That is what Bhabha says, right? So that is Homi Bhabha's idea. So similarly, so this idea is also something that Soja is looking at, and that is why he says, the third is in fact a space of othering. Othering as in, space of othering as in, it doesn't mean that the third is actually othering, but that it gives space to the other, right? The third space is also the space of the other. So whoever has been othered. So if you're looking at women in a patriarchal society, or, if you're looking at the transgender, like transgender people, again, is that a kind of othering that happens? Or whether, it is a race that is othered, or, people who are colored people, like that, when people are branded as colored people, and again, that kind of an othering. So all these, others would also become part of the third space, right? So it is not. So when you look at the first space or second space perspectives, often it could be the majoritarian perspectives. So that is why here it is not the center, but in fact the periphery that actually dominates, right? So not really dominate, but it's not that it dominates, but the periphery is actually given importance here. Okay, so that is a peripheral thinking is in fact foregrounded. Okay, so that is the idea of othering. So you can see even in literature how if you look at in fact, the post-colonial literature, or even the post-colonial readings, or any other, the newer forms, how it actually gives space to the other, right? So That is another thing. So now, moving on to this concept of place, right? So we were talking about how a place disappears in so when we talked about the sellout. So place can be seen as a space which is named, a space which has boundaries and borders. Then it is related to history. It is related to identity construction. So it has again temporal elements there, time bound, relational, personality. So this is again, I've taken all these from different theorists. So some of them include like Tim Cresswell. Then you have space and place. This is Yifu Tuan's. So Tuan's idea, topophilia, again, that is Tuan's idea. Sorry, I forgot to add the name there. Then you have others, in fact, in fact, this is again from different people. Okay, so I haven't really given all the details there, but just for your information, these came from all these theorists put together. Okay, so I've just combined everything. You can find it in different texts, in fact. So we can just say, space which is named, right? So a place for a place, that is it. The idea of, so place is not just another space, but it has to have a name. As in, this is again a kind of a definition, right? So if you look at any place, in fact, place names generate a lot of interest, right? So a lot of political interest, so a lot of socio-political interest. So how, you have all these issues with place names, and then place names are changed, and how these things are actually how they gain significance in our society, right? So in our contemporary society, how, so this is something, if you look at history, you can see like how, places and the place naming. So that is, toponymy is in fact a branch, right? So it's something that is actually studied in detail, the whole idea of place naming and everything, right? So that is something. So again, places would have like boundaries, geographical boundaries, and then how they have political borders. So they have a certain kind of a history, and they are time, as in a place. Again, when you define a place, you also have to look at the time, right? So as in how so places can actually, again, if you're looking at the area or the shape or the borders, boundaries, all these things keep evolving, right? So there is a kind of that temporal element also associated with that. So it is again related to identity construction. So that is, it actually gives you the like how identity of people who live there, right? So whether you're giving the identity of a place, if you're looking at the identity of a place as such, you'll consider different factors, right? The geographical factors, then the topography, the landscape, all those details. And again, if you're looking at the identity of the people there, you look at other socio-cultural factors, in fact. So how all those things, again, matter. So if you read this essay, that is Space and Place, a Humanistic Perspective by Yifu Tuan, you will get a solid understanding of how, place has been studied. So another thing that place theorists, for instance, look at would be the concept of, how stability, right? So how stability matters. So this is where, in mobility studies, they are challenging this whole concept of stability, right? So it's something that we all have been experiencing, how, many of our things have been destabilized. Then personality, right? So again, how, places have a certain kind of a personality, and then, how with the kind of monuments there, or, the public spaces and then the private spaces, how they create a certain personality. Spirit, as in, this is again now related to what Tuan says is, so either the spirit as what you find, it could be spirit as we understand, right? So the if you have a place of worship there, or the other supernatural forces or those spirits kind, and the other one is the spirit of a place. So what we mean by that, right? So when you look at that, how those things actually come into play, right? So these are some ideas. Then there is this concept called non-place that is coming from Mark Auge. So he looks at like, just if he says, if a place is relational, historical, and concerned with identity, then a non-place is exactly something that is not concerned with any of these. And for him, he gives some examples like airport spaces, then the shopping mall, and those kind of a subway. So all these could be seen as non-places. But this is again Mark Auge's idea, and this has been challenged by mobility theorists like John Urry and then Mimi Scheller and some of these theorists. Okay, so a non-place is again something, for that he brings in this concept of supermodernity. So supermodernity, as in again like how you lead a very limited amount of time in these spaces. So non-places are almost like just, they can't be really called places. That's what August says. For instance, if you go to an airport, you spend a certain amount of time there, and then you meet some people there, but you don't really have a kind of a relation with them in such a way. But then this has been challenged in a certain other ways. If you want to look at these details, for that you have to look at non-plays an introduction to supermodernity, that is Mark August. Okay. So now when we were talking about this concept of boundary and those things, so now we can also say, how this is actually related to this idea of territoriality, right? So human beings as territorial beings. So just as we said, we are spatial beings, we are also territorial beings. So when you look at animals, right? So we'll say, the turf wars and those things. So cats mark their territory, dogs mark their territory in certain ways. So similarly, human beings, right? So we also have our territory. So now this is again, we have our so in the animal world, it's a little more simplistic, right? So they have a certain kind of a thing, and then, it's meant to have a certain whatever, right, of a certain purpose. But when you're looking at the human world, we have our micro territories and our macro territories. So if you look at this idea, like, even our body can be seen as a kind of a territory, right? So the body can be a territorial marker, right? So like how, our, it's not like, you don't give access, you don't give permission for everyone to be in your space, right? So there is a certain kind of understanding that you can't intrude into someone's personal space that way. So the body itself is a kind of a territorial marker that way. So that is there begins our whole idea of, whole thing, or, the concept of borders and boundaries and those things. And now that is something that we have been dealing with, right? So how each body has so much of this idea of boundary in the COVID times, how, this idea of micro territories working, in fact. So similarly, if you look at a more extended micro territories, so this idea is that our body is a kind of a personal bubble. So this was put forward by Edward T. Hall, and this is something when you're looking at even these communication studies and personality development and those things, you would see this, right? So how, body language and those things also matter, right? So this is something that came there, but this idea is again explored by people like Ali Madanipur in the public and private spaces of the city. So there he talks about that. Even Soja talks about this in the political organization of space. So in that, so when you look at micro territories, again, it could be like, how your home, your house can be a micro territory, your neighborhood can be a micro territory. So maybe, to a certain extent, right? So from there, if you look at macro territory like a nation, right? So when you look at it, it's a huge territory. So when you look at these smaller spaces, so at least so in general, what we can say is, like, in the animal world, this whole idea of territoriality is instinctual in nature. So it is guided by their instinct. So they have a natural instinct there. So do we also have this kind of an instinct in play? So if you look at that, these micro territories, in fact, there would be that, right? So you will identify with your immediate spaces, in fact. So maybe up to your, your immediate surroundings, your apart from your body, where you live, right? So where you live and work, or, you study or whatever, right? So again, your city, or, the village that you come from. So those, again, you may identify. But then when it comes to something as large as a nation, it's more of a politically organized space. Even certain micro territories, even if you look at the concept of a city or a village, those are also governed by the politics of space. But if you look at the macro territories, right? So certainly something like a nation, that is that again, like Soja says, that is from the Western world, or any of these nation theorists, if you see, they do talk about it, that nation is a Western concept, right? So it's a relatively younger concept, and it's something, right? So again, so when it comes to macro territories, so our instinct may not be always spot on. It's maybe something that is guided by these ideologies, right? So socio-cultural, political ideologies, how, all these are shaped. That is why, right? So this whole idea of nationalism is being debated, which is, if you actually connect it with this concept of territoriality, you'll understand this better. So these are some of the other terms that comes in with spatial studies. Heterotopias, which is Foucault's ideas. Heterotopia means other space. Okay, so in that sense. Then chronotope, that is Bakhtin's idea, that is the concept of space-time. Topophilia, again, related to Thuan, that is a concept of, how you have an affection for a place. Non-place is August. Okay, so these are some of the concepts. So geocriticism, so when you move into that, so far, I hope this has been, the idea of space, place, territoriality, some of these concepts you understood. So without actually looking at these concepts, you can't go into geocriticism or spatial literary studies. So if you are interested in spatial literary studies, you'll have to read a lot on, sociology, geography, then so across disciplines, right? So philosophy, so you may have to, work, it becomes a totally interdisciplinary field. So geocriticism is particularly, as you see, with the term criticism, it is concerned with literary studies and literary criticism. And just as we said, we have like other earlier forms like Richard Lehan's the city in literature, for instance, that is also a kind of a study on the city, right? But here in spatial literary studies, we'll be bringing in all these ideas, like for instance, Soja's idea or Lefebvre's idea or Foucault's idea. So similarly, these theorists, that is these these critics, in fact, Burton Westphal and Robert Talley, they are the ones who actually developed this field called geocriticism, and this is particularly associated with them and their groups. Okay, so otherwise, Talley himself says that this has been in existence for a long time, and whether so you call yourself a geocritic or not, spatial literary studies has been in existence. And these are some other influences. So Gaston Bachelor, then De Soto's everyday practices. So that is something that influenced again. Then Foucault, Mumford, that is the one that I mentioned earlier, the city in history. Then Thuan, Lefebvre, Soja, so Harvey. So many of these people. Then this is another, Deleuze and Guattari. So Guattari and Deleuze have been again a major influence on geocriticism. So their idea of geophilosophy, right? So that is another major influence, geophilosophy and the concept of the rhizomatics and deterritorialization. So that is another thing. So this whole idea, like, when we're talking about third space, in fact, so how, again, the idea of root tree system, that is something that is questioned. And then the idea of rhizomatics, or the idea of a rhizome that is put forward by Deleuze and Guattari. So that is also something that influenced these studies. So what do we mean by now geocriticism, or in current spatial literary studies, what are some of the things that we do, right? So we just look at this idea. So I'm not going into that history again. Just look at quickly some of the important concepts. Okay, so this is globality and heterogeneity. So earlier we said, right, so how, if you look at even in eco-criticism, if you look at the history, you'll find that the early studies were related more to, towards the, it was related to this whole idea of location and local coloring, regionalism, and those things, right? So from there, we are going into the global concepts, right? So it's not just the local, but the global concepts, also the global and the local, right? So you can say, like how the local also becomes foregrounded there. Then relation between people and spaces, then social space, lived space. So all, like, what we discussed, right? So these are some of the things. Again, it's not just from a single perspective, but multiple perspectives. Then this is geo-centered rather than ego-centered. So that is, if you're, rather than looking at just one author's perspective, you can look at several authors. So if you're studying geocriticism, if you're studying text, for instance, if you're studying fiction, or say, any kind of literary work, so let's look at a few writers across, right? So that is the idea there, and how multiple perspectives need to be foregrounded. Then polycentrous. So in general, when we say, a place, the first thing that comes to our mind is the visual impact, right? So that is something even Thuan looks at. He gives his idea of, like, how the visibility and those things matter. But he also talks about, like, how you need to understand a place with your other senses, right? So so from there, like, you can get, right? So how do we actually, so you may actually, for instance, you may have this idea, like when you go to a particular place, you associate a certain kind of a smell, or it's your, how do we actually taste a place is something very relational again, like, maybe it is related to the food that is there, or, some other thing, some other taste that comes to our mind. So it could be related to the memory that is coming to them. That's, so, you may have, associated certain places have certain smell, or then of course the sound, right? So what is it, right? What is the kind? So if you're in a village, or, if you're in the countryside, you may get to hear the birds and those again animals more. But when you're going further into a city, then all you may have is more of those noises, right? So the pollution and those things. Even in a city, like if you are in the daytime, you get to know if you're living in a city where you have a railroad running close by, then you don't really get to hear the trains whistling. But then when at night, when the road traffic is less, you actually get to hear the trains, right? So that is something, those kind of details which come into play there, right? So those are some of the ways in which we can actually look at that. So now there are different tools apart from just critiquing text, doing a textual analysis. You can also look at work with digital humanities techniques like mapping, and several other like digital humanities tools are used to study this. And now we'll look at a few examples and then wind up. From fiction. Okay, so this is here I'm looking at particularly how New York City has been represented in several South Asian American texts. Okay, so this is the natural and the billscapes, people and immigrants. This is from Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalists. So you can see this. I remember the sense of wonder the day I reported for duty. There, that is the Underwood and Sampson, this is this particular organization's offices were perched on the 41st and 42nd floors of a building in Midtown. And while I had previously flown in airplanes and visited the Himalayas, nothing had prepared me for the drama, the power of the view from their lobby. So here you can see how in this particular novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Changis, the protagonist, is actually, he's looking at these skyscrapers, the high rises of this particular office where his office is located. And he's looking at them with such an awe that for him, even the Himalayas is like, he says, that is nothing compared to this. So how, from the natural, so when you look at Himalayas, it's where is Himalayas and where are these skyscrapers that human beings built? But that is his idea, and especially for him, New York, right? So New York City is something that has so much to do with his, for all his love for New York. But we'll see how this actually changes in the post 9/11 context. But can it be always the same? So this is his idea, right? So now again from the same novel, quoting from that, the American flag invaded New York after the attacks. It was everywhere. We are America, not New York, which means the mightiest civilization of the world has ever known. You have slighted us, beware our wrath. So we were saying, right, how, in this novel, if you see throughout, he says in the 4.5 years I lived in America, I've never been a New Yorker. I've never been an American, but a New Yorker. So he prides himself to be a New Yorker. He is actually, Changis has moved from Lahore. This is a Pakistani American novel. So he has moved from Lahore to New Jersey. He studies in Princeton, and then he gets a job in New York, and that's when he moves to New York. And for him, New York, and he says, he always carries, he could easily identify with the city. But suddenly in the 9/11 context, we see that, in the, like he gets to see this from Manila. So again, another city, he moves to another city, and from there he sees the Twin Towers falling in a news channel. And then suddenly this Changis, right? So who has been praising New York all along, he suddenly, when the Twin Towers fall, he doesn't say that, it's anymore a New York thing, right? So he identifies that with America. So now you find, right, America has also been, again, like New York has been treating its immigrants very well so far in Changis's eyes. He says, a very multicultural city that way has been always, he can identify several things from New York, and he associates with his hometown, or his city of Lahore. But suddenly in the change context, New York starts treating its immigrants in a different way, and the immigrants too starts looking at New York in a different way. So then we see how this whole idea of can cities actually be dissociate themselves from the nation. So that is where the politics of these macro territories come into play. So is it actually possible, right? So these things come into play there. And again, we see how, so whatever, how much ever you say, you are associated with these kind of artifacts or the high rises and those things, those don't give you that solace anymore when you have these kind of issues, right? So when you have a socio-cultural issue. So now again, this is moving to namesake, which is a little, in fact, earlier, which has been from an earlier context, earlier period. So in that, Ashima says, for Ashima, migrating to the suburbs feels more drastic, more distressing than the move from Calcutta to Cambridge had been. She wishes Ashok had accepted the position at Northeastern so that she could have stayed in the city. She's stunned that in this town there are no sidewalks to speak of, no street lights, no. So this is when Ashima moves from Calcutta to Cambridge, that is from Calcutta to Cambridge, then from there again, from the Cambridge, as in from that city there, they move further to a suburb, and then for her suddenly that is too much. So the suburb life is like, she has been always exposed to the noise and the busy life of Calcutta, and suddenly, when she moves to the suburb, feels very lonely. But then again, after living in the suburb for a few, for some time, and then when they go to New York, suddenly it becomes, New York is too much, too many cars, too many tall buildings. So it becomes a city composed of paroxysmal spaces, a universe that is constantly exploding. This is in De Soto's words. Okay, so I would say, this is how Ashima and Ashok feel. So Ashima and Ashok, who had actually, when they moved from Calcutta to Cambridge, and then, when had they moved from Calcutta to New York directly, they may not have really felt it that way. But from the suburbs, suddenly, so how, these changes actually give you different ideas, right? So in this, if you see, you can see, it gives you this whole idea of, cars and then buildings. They give you that visual impact, and they also give you, when you say cars, obviously, they mean too much of noise and those kind of things, right? So how it also gives you an understanding from an auditory perspective. And but if you're looking at the younger generation, they are definitely more comfortable in a place like New York. For them, it's easier to identify with that city more, right? So this is something. So internal and international migration, how it actually changes perspective. Now, this is another one where, you get the auditory thing in a clearer way. This is from Ina Alexander's Manhattan Music. A sharp sound, and she felt it like music. Sandhya lifted her weight in the wooden bench at the edge of Central Park. A tinkle, perhaps a pebble striking glass. Then she saw him in the middle distance, a small man balancing on a cycle. The street was curiously empty and allowed her a full view of the assortment of mirrors tied to the back of his bicycle. So you can see again, like, the glass, the bicycle there. So the visual details, and then, even the glass, how the sound of that bicycle, the tinkle there, like, how she feels it is like music, right? So the Manhattan, the city's music that happens. So now this is very, as she says, curious, a New York street being empty, something pretty something that you can't suddenly associate, right? And that too in near Central Park, right? So this is something like, something which actually catches her attention that way. So that is about, like, she gives different examples of how the music of Manhattan flows. Now, this is actually moving into a full-fledged little India enclave. This is from The Transplanted Man by Sanjay Nigam. And here again, you can see, different visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, all those details come into play here. Right? Hindi film songs blaring from stores with names like Raju's Pan Shop, Desi Dosa Palace, and Aapka Dukan, old Lata and Kishore melodies competed with latest disco bhangra rhythms. Menus in restaurant windows advertise tandoori chicken, aloo chaat, uttapams, and kulfis. With last night's trash stuffed in bins up and down the Indian bazaar, smells of spices and fried sweets mixed with more disagreeable odors. So this is in the Little India Enclave in New York, and so this is how the city is represented. So he says, right, so if you're looking at the Little India Enclave, so if you're looking at any of these, so Little India, as in, these are ethnic enclaves, right? So how, it gets recreated there. So this is Little India. So there, you have near that, you have Chinatown, the Little Korea, Little Vietnam, all those, the little spaces, the miniature miniatures of these nations, right? So this is something that is recreated there in the American space in New York, and again, this is again getting represented in fiction, right? So how the author is actually representing all these, so he sees all these, like, so you can hear film song sets. It's not something that you may be expecting in New York, right? So how again, you get to listen to all these, and then you have all these smells there. It's a smell that just when you visit any street in India, that same smell, that odor actually permeates there. And the only thing, but then that is missing, as he says, is an auto rickshaw. So that is not something that you can plant in New York, right? And that actually sadly reminds you of all the difference. That's what the this character there in the novel feels. Okay, so now again, if you go, okay, so this is something which I've already mentioned, and this is from Sanjay Nigam's Transplanted Man. So in Transplanted Man, you find this entire story set in a little India enclave. So you have like how, ethnic enclaves and the purpose of an ethnic enclave, the economic aspects. So you'll get to study a lot of things from that, how ethnic enclaves. So it's not just like showcasing the cultural aspects, but how they have a certain kind of a purpose. They provide jobs to different people, and how that also actually comes into play. So there are studies on that. Like if you're looking at, from economics, also you'll find certain studies on this ethnic enclaves. So now moving on to the basement kitchens of New York from Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss, which is partially set in New York, right? So in Inheritance of Loss, what you find is, so far we have been talking about all these immigrants. If you're looking at Chungus, he's he's one of those, he's an Ivy League graduate, in fact. So he's a well-to-do immigrant that way, or at least, he's in the scholarly circle. And then then if you're looking at Ashima or Ashok, again, they belong to the, more into the upscale kind of immigrants, right? So those immigrants who are supposed to be the privileged ones, and the legal immigrants, privileged ones, and those immigrants who are considered like model minorities, right? So those kind of immigrants. But now when you're looking at this person, that is Biju, this is a cook's son in Inheritance of Loss. If you've read Inheritance of Loss, you'd know this. Otherwise, I don't know how to actually, this is the only thing that I can tell you. I mean, this is the easiest way to tell you, that is, he's the son of a cook in that novel. And he is an illegal immigrant. He just manages to somehow go to New York through some illegal means. So Biju at Baby Bistro, above the restaurant was French, but below in the kitchen it was Mexican and Indian. And when Paki arrived, in quotes, it was Mexican, Indian, and Pakistani. Biju at La Colonial. So, again, it is describing that basement kitchen, and how, this basement kitchen has American flag on top. So that is American flag in the restaurant, and then restaurant top, and then on top of the restaurant, and then below, that is in the basement kitchen, you have all these different flags, of all the nationalities of the people serving in those kitchens. Okay. And from there, now you see when from there, so Biju has been always, for him, he has hardly seen New York. His life has been just confined to this basement kitchen. And from there, when he goes back to his hometown of Kalimpong, in that is when he says, like, this is what he sees. Biju hadn't seen such vastness in a long time. The sheer overwhelming enormity of mountainside and scree coming down the flank of it. He felt exhilarated by the immensity of the wilderness, by the shooting, hooting abundance of green, the great caterwauling vulgarity of the frogs that was like the sound of the earth and the air itself. So far we have been seeing a very, all those earlier descriptions of New York. If you look at how New York has been represented in those other novels, right? So whether it's Reluctant Fundamentalist or, despite the 9/11 happening there, right? So all the, we've been looking at New York as something that is, where, you can, everything, whatever you can dream of, you get it there, right? So from there, and Chungus says, this is nothing, even Himalayas is nothing compared to the skyscrapers of New York. That is from Reluctant Fundamentalist. And now when you look at here, this is a different perspective. That is Biju's perspective, an illegal immigrant, somebody who belongs to the marginalized section, right? So when he is going to the this city, and then for him it has not been that kind of an experience. So again, now so there may be these questions, right? So mostly if you look at, even if you're moving away from literature, in fact, even if you look at many Indians, in fact, when they go out, right? So when they migrate to the cities, some of these global cities, so you will find that they talk about it in a very aha terms, right? So they always try to give you this impression that Indian cities, or India's just like nothing compared to that India, or in any of these South Asian immigrants, right? So they will talk about that in that sense. But their perspective about their hometowns, even despite all their nostalgia and those things, so they may have start having a kind of skeptical about their homelands in a different way, something. They may or may not be proud of their homelands, right? So it depends. Sometimes they have all these nostalgia and those things, but there is always this tendency to assimilate. But then when you see how somebody from a lower strata actually goes there, like how that person feels. But again, I don't know whether that is the case in all the novels, at least or that is the case in reality too, but at least in Kiran Desai is actually giving this idea too. Okay, so how people when move from, because mostly we associate, unlike in many other, especially from people who migrate to America, at least to the US or the UK, mostly you associate them with educated immigrants, right? So, but we also know that there are others who are from the unskilled group, or even the semi-skilled groups, right? So mostly it's not just the highly skilled professionals who migrate. So here Biju is an unskilled migrant and unskilled laborer, right? So that way you can say unskilled labor group, that in that sense. So in that sense, he's not able to find anything great about New York. It's only back in his hometown. So here again, coming back to that Himalayan setting and how that actually, changes his, that is when he actually breathes fresh air. Right, so you can see, so that is what Soja and what Bhabha says by this whole idea of othering, and right, how that other perspectives are something that you can find in literature, right? So again, like so even in other studies, these things are coming up, of course, but all the things coming put together, right? So that is the beauty of the literary space. So when you are studying, so again, like when if you want to divide this into the spatial perspectives, the idea of place, so all these things, the idea of territory, so you can further break these studies down into many of these. So any of these examples that I was talking about so far, so you can actually look at different perspectives here. Okay, so these are some of the examples. So with this, I think I'll wind up. I'll conclude my presentation for the day. I hope I hope that was something, some useful session for you all. Thank you. So, ma'am. Yeah. Ma'am Sheila, ma'am Prasida, anybody? Yeah.
So now it's time for discussion. Am I audible?
Yeah, right. Yes.
It was quite an enlightening class, a topic which is quite new for many of us. So now it's time for discussion. Students, participants, and presenters, you could just switch on your mic and ask questions, or type the questions in the chat box.
How does virtual space affect embodied sociality? Oh my God, why is it? Especially be a non-desirable permanent state of existence.
Okay, there's a question from Rasina Mustafa. How does virtual space affect embodied sociality, especially when it is largely perceived to be a non-desirable permanent state of existence? How does that's a question.
Right. So, Razina, is this a student from Mercy, or I don't know exactly who you are, but anyway, okay, your question is, see, when you say largely perceived to be a non-desirable state, who perceives it to be? So it depends on who is perceiving it, right? So is it really, you are just taking it as a general opinion? So maybe, there are many people who consider it that way as non-desirable, but I don't know for everyone whether that is exactly non-desirable. And how does it affect embodied sociality? So that would again depend on, there are many people who are actually, if you're looking at, for instance, even the people who are like social media influencers or people who are interested in social media spaces. So certainly, right. So if you're looking at YouTubers or even Instagrammers, so you will find that they are not. I don't know whether they actually consider it all that non-desirable, but it just depends on, this is this idea which actually, when you look at from the idea of non-place and then coming into how, places are also becoming not like non-places. That is what John Urry and Mimi Scheller is talking about. So this, when I connect it with that theory, or even if it's from my idea, my opinion is it depends. So you can't just say affecting it, in the sense that again depends, right? So it will depend. So instead of generalizing, I think this is something for which you will have to probably do a study across different sections of the society, right? So that is, I don't know whether I've answered your question, but yeah, but certainly, it has a certain, but it doesn't mean that you can't actually go out into the real space and then, you can't really actually communicate that way, right? It gives you a larger, in fact, audience, it gives you a larger group of people to communicate with. But if you want to actually, again, if you want to have a meetup with the people you're talking to, or, it may help you in some way or the other. How does it affect? As in, you can't, of course, see them face to face. You can't really, certain kinds of things, and you can't certainly, for instance, if you're looking at somebody's, see, when you actually, one big aspect would be the concept of body language, right? Because in the real space, we know that when people, however much they are guarded with their body language, it's something that you can easily understand. But if you're looking at the virtual space, the body language there, sometimes you can't. If there is a technical issue, if there is a technical noise there, then you can't really say, somebody may be smiling and then, something happens to that video, something else will go wrong with that. So, certain kinds of these issues will come into play there. Then, of course, when, if you're typing or, if you're writing something there, the issue of language use, again, like, whether you sound rude, whether you're, so, such questions would come into play when you're looking at sociality, the concept of socializing in that sense, right? Now, this is another important thing that I should say for people like Soja and Lefebvre, or anybody who studies these spaces, social spaces are not just equivalent to socialized spaces, okay? So it is not just about socializing, it is more than that. So if you look at it that way, virtual space is also a part of our social space, in fact. Okay, so it is not just limited to socializing. This is, in fact, becoming part of our reality that way. All right. So, Razina, does that answer your question in some way? Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody?
Do we have any more questions? Yes, there's a question from Shujala. Is the third space a combination of both the perceived and conceived spaces and more?
Yeah. So the third space has, it is a combination of both, but the third space has but it doesn't mean, just because it is a combination, it would be just like, it has just those qualities, but the third space has its own qualities. So that is the idea. All right. Okay, Shujila. Actually, it would be good if, you can ask instead of just typing. I mean, that would also be great, so that, you can, this is something, I guess, this whole idea of virtual space, what you were talking about. Because I really like it when people talk. I make my students talk a lot in my classes, whether it's real or virtual. I don't just let them sit simply. And if I'm seeing you in that same way, I hope, I want I hope I can listen to some of you. Will that be possible? Anybody? Any more questions?
Participants who have any doubts, any clarifications, you could just ask questions.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I'm Shijila. Ma'am,
Okay.
can you please elaborate on the different spaces that you talked about, heterotopia, chronotope, and a few others?
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that question. So heterotopia, as in this idea is that other space. So this is from Foucault's. Okay, this is Foucault's concept. So what Foucault says is like how you have utopia, right? So utopia is considered to be this ideal space, but at the same time, utopia, the utopic space is something that is not something that is real, or something that may not really exist, right? So in that sense, but heterotopias are real spaces, the other spaces. So he gives a set of examples there, and there are certain ways in which you can, certain characteristics of these heterotopias. So some of the examples that he gives include, for instance, hospital spaces, particularly if you're looking at mental health care centers, right? So then prisons, how they all serve as heterotopias. Then if you're looking at a cemetery, for instance, then how they serve as these other spaces in a certain in our societies, right? So how again you have certain ways in which you have certain rituals to enter these spaces, and how you need to have a certain kind of things involved in that, right? So these are some of the things. So if you read, if you look at looking at Foucault's essay on heterotopias, other spaces, in that you'll get further details. Okay, so that is one thing. Then chronotopes, that is Bakhtin's idea. It's not something that I've actually worked on so much, but that is space time, like how the concept of space and time, like just as how you have space time in physics, like how this whole thing comes in. So you can actually refer to that a bit. Then topophilia is this is Tuan, Yufu Tuan, and then even people like Bachelet have talked about it. So this is the idea of like topo, as in topo is always like when we say topo, it's related to space, right? So space, and philia is affection. So similarly, heterotopia as in hetero is other. Chronotope, chrono represents time, and tope is that topos are like space. So that way, space time. So here, topophilia is affection, or love for a place. So how you feel, you may be looking at like how like how you may be connected to spaces, or connected to places, how you may actually relate to places, right? So those kind of things. For instance, you may like a particular place, and it may be your hometown, it may be your homeland, it may be some other place. So how all those things are actually interconnected there. Okay, so then anything else, any other, Shijila, any other any other concept that you would like to know?
No, ma'am. Now these are clear. I didn't actually. I didn't get the third one.
All right. Yeah.
Now it's clear, ma'am. I should look into these things. I should look more into it, ma'am.
Yeah, so how sometimes this kind of a topophilia can also become sometimes it can actually lead to other issues, right? So when you are extremely attached to a particular place, right? So you can actually look at it from how even political perspectives and those things also come into play there. Yeah, so there's this question. All right, okay, so that is the idea. You can of course look at this a little bit more.
Thank you, ma'am.
Then, yeah. Can we include idea of geographical space relation between identity and place under spatial studies? Yeah, so even that can be included under spatial studies. So spatial studies, if you're looking at spatial studies as it is, in fact, many of these people, Tuan is a geographer, I mean, then you have even Soja's, he's also an urban geographer. So many of them are geographers, right? So Tuan is a human geographer, as I said. So they are there also. You can look at geographic space, then the relationship between identity and place under Yeah, of course, right? So that also comes under spatial studies. So spatial studies that way is an umbrella term, and it can be related to geography, it can be sociology, history. So this is something that, just as Soja is talking about the trialectics of space, he also talks about trialectics of being, and he says how you have sociality, spatiality, and then the those dialectics, the trialectics coming into play there, right? So that is something he's again talking about. So all these can be interconnected. Yeah. Yes. It depends on, again, like, if you're looking at it from a particular discipline's perspective, so you may be again working more with those tools. So that is the thing. So if you are, for instance, a geographer, you may be looking at it from those perspectives, and then, you may be. So it also depends on, the kind of tools that you use to study these, or, the methods and the methodologies that you follow. So that way, some of these may slightly differ. Is this, just 1 second, is this form meant for the students or for me, this feedback form?
The feedback form is meant for the participants.
The students, right? I mean, yeah, students and the other participants. Okay, right. Any doubts, any questions, or anything that you wish to say? Okay.
Are there any questions? If there are no more questions, I think let's wind up the session.
Yeah.
I think I'll just enter the vote of thanks. Respected Principal, Dr. Sister Gisela, Head of the Department of English, Dr. Sheena John, today's resource person, keynote speaker, Dr. Gopika Shankar, seminar participants, presenters, other teachers of the department, and dear students. On the behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. First and foremost, I thank our keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Gopika Shankar, Assistant Professor, English and Foreign Language University, who enlightened us with her knowledge and presence in the contemporary topic, Spatial Literary Studies. I also express my heartfelt gratitude to Reverend Sister Gisela George for her support throughout the seminar. We are grateful to our head of the department, Dr. Sheena John, for her stewardship, support, vision, and commitment. I thank all the presenters and participants who made this seminar an academic success. I owe my gratitude to all the teachers of the department, our non-teaching staff, Ms. Reena Wilson, our technical support, Mr. Jace John, for making this function a resounding success. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Yeah. Thank you all too.
Dear participants, kindly note that there is a feedback form that has been posted. An overall feedback form will be posted later. That is, it will be posted now. You are expected to fill both the feedback forms. So participants, kindly note, there are two feedback forms. One is the session feedback and the other is the general feedback. You are expected to fill both the feedback forms. Also, there will be no paper presentation session in the afternoon. So we will be concluding our seminar, PRAJWALA, here. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Gopika.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all. And it was nice meeting you all after a long time.
Yeah. Same here.
Thank you for inviting me, and then, of course, for all the lovely words that you were speaking about me, ma'am.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing from you again, maybe on some other platform.
Yeah. Sometime once all these things are over, we can definitely meet there. Yeah.
Okay.
All right then, ma'am. Okay then. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye, ma'am. Bye, ma'am. Prasida. Yeah.
Gopika?
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you.
Hi, Gopika. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Hi,
Hi, ma'am.
nice seeing you.
Ma'am, so Miss Meena is not here. Ma'am, Meena is not there.
Who were you asking for?
Ma'am, Meena?
Gopika? Okay.
Ma'am, Meena is not there.
Ma'am, Meena, I think she's a bit.
Okay. All right.
We have some NAC work happening, you know.
Okay,
So I think she's
right.
busy with that.
Okay. Yeah. Fine.
Meena is also filling in
Ma'am,
the form.
Meena is also.
All of us are here.
Okay.
Yeah. She was a coordinator yesterday.
Ah,
Today, I think all the work that is piled up,
okay.
is working on.
Right.
How are you? All good?
Yeah,
I
going.
think we have a lot of participants. We have to talk separately. This will not work. Many of them are online. I think we talk later.
Okay. Yeah. Sure, ma'am. I'll call you in the
Very,
evening. Right. Okay. And I'm from Hyderabad University, not
One or two of them are.
not from EFLU. That's something I wanted to say. I would know, but
Okay.
okay,
then.
ma'am. Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you. Yeah. Bye. Ending this. Yeah.